Okay, so if you've watched my video on CZ, moissanite, glass stones, and natural diamond, and how to identify it and what's the difference between them, today's video is going to be an add-on to that. Today I'm going to show you how to identify and test jade, sapphire, and emerald at home. However, these tests aren't going to be conclusive, as you can't necessarily look at a gem and tell if it's natural or not. You actually need to take it to a professional who specializes in this stuff and get it tested that way. So, that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video though. So first things first, let's go over some general testing methods. Methods that you can do at home to test these specific things, specifically jade stones. So number one general identification method is the color transparency. Natural gemstones seem to have a very deep color to them depending on what gemstone it is. So for example, sapphires would have a very, very deep blue to them, and jade would be like the very deep yellow, or the very deep color that a jade is. I forget what color a jade is. However, with these colors may come very slight variations. This means differences in patterns under the microscope and all that other fun stuff. So if you put it under a microscope and it has a different variation, say you have two natural sapphires and one sapphire is like snowflake and then another sapphire looks like a diamond almost, then you know that it's more than likely natural, because you know it has different variations and a very deep transparent color to it. In addition to this, if the general gemstone seems to be too uniform or too vibrant, then it might be synthetic or it just could be dyed. And the number two way is inclusions and flaws. Natural gemstones such as jade, emerald, or sapphire, they usually have natural flaws to them, so it's not going to make them look like a diamond. That's what sets them apart from the diamond, because a diamond is usually cut flawlessly, whereas the sapphires and the other natural gemstones aren't. If it is, however, if it is cut like a diamond, then it is either extremely treated or extremely rare. However, it is kind of hard to conclude on this because, like I said before, these gemstones can develop natural synthetic patterns when they're being made earthly. Now number three is going to be the hardness test or the scratch test. Now generally these gemstones are going to be resistant to scratching, similar to that of a diamond, from pieces or gemstones or some other stuff that have a lower hardness on Mohs scale. That being said though, the general hardness of these stones is a 6 to a 7 for a jade, a 7.5 to an 8 for an emerald, and a 9 for a sapphire. So a sapphire is going to be the hardest gemstone that is among these three that I'm talking about on Mohs scale. A diamond is even harder than that, with a 10 on Mohs scale, and a moissanite is almost as hard as a sapphire. Now, when held under light specifically, natural gemstones will have a very deep luster to them, which means they are going to shine almost like a diamond, but not as clearly. However, this can be contradicted to identify an artificial stone, because if it appears overly dull or overly glassy underneath a light, then it may be artificial. Speaking of light though, UV light test. A UV light is a really good way to test any type of gemstone. Generally, stones like sapphires aren't going to shine very much, or not going to shine at all under a UV light if they're natural. If they do shine, then it might be extremely treated or just artificial. And finally, number 6 is the temperature test. This is where you put a gemstone in your hand and you hold it. And natural gemstones are going to feel cool to the touch, meaning if you take a cold sapphire or just a sapphire out of the wild or a jade out of the wild, then and you put it in your hand, then it is going to take longer to warm up compared to glass, plastic, or a highly treated stone. Now let's get into the stone specific tests, the stone specific explanations. For jades, these things, what you can do for the field test is jades usually have a generally cool and waxy feel to them. So if a jade doesn't feel like it's smooth and waxy, then it might not be a natural jade. And number 2 for jades is the sound test. Jades have a very deep resonant sound when they're pressed against another gemstone. So if you tap a jade against a gemstone and it lets out a deep resonant sound to it, though you have to listen very closely, then it may be natural. However, this test isn't very conclusive. And number 3 under this is the scratch test. Jade is very tough, but it's also not very well scratched, so it's kind of resistant to scratches. So if you take a knife and you lightly scratch it, if you gently scratch it, and it's not scratched at all, or is barely scratched, then it could be natural. Now, a final test that you can do, but it's not very conclusive, is a UV light test. Natural jade does not shine fluorescently underneath a UV light. However, treated jade may shine extremely fluorescently underneath a UV light, so this test isn't very conclusive, but it may help you. Now let's get into emeralds. So first things first, visually with emeralds, they usually have like very visible inclusions like bubbles or mossy like look to them. Now number 2 is a refraction test. Refraction, if it shines like a diamond, then it might be a treated emerald. However, natural emerald does not shine that much compared to a diamond. So if you put it under light and it refracts a lot, then it's more than likely treated or artificial. However, if it doesn't really shine that much, then it might be natural. And finally, number 3 for emeralds is the color consistency to them. Emeralds generally have inconsistent color shade to them. So on one side it might appear a darker green, and on another side it might appear a lighter shade of green. This is going to be your natural gemstone. This is going to be your natural emerald. However, treated emeralds and very synthetic emeralds, they appear flawless. They appear completely green, no color inclusions anywhere. Now, finally, sapphires. And one of your most useful tests for this is going to be the scratch test. Sapphires are extremely hard. They are one of the hardest natural gemstones known to mankind, other than a diamond and a moissanite. So, sapphires can only be scratched by a diamond. So if you have a sapphire that you think might be artificial, then you can take a knife or a pin or a thumbtack or anything like that and scratch it lightly. And if it doesn't scratch, then you might have yourself a natural sapphire. As for fluorescence under UV light, if you put a sapphire under UV light and it doesn't shine very much, then it might be a natural sapphire. However, if it shines like a diamond or shines like a moissanite or shines like a cubic zirconia or a glass stone or whatever you want to label it, then it might just be a treated sapphire or an artificial sapphire. Now let's get into some advanced tests that jewelers usually do. So if you go to the jewelry store, then they usually do this stuff to test your gemstone. However, if you have access to these tests by yourself at home, by all means, go for that. Number 1 being a refractive index test. So using a refractive index machine, they test the refractive index of each gemstone to determine if it is artificial or natural. And each stone has its own unique refractive index to it, so it's all not going to be the same. And if you have many gemstones, for example, if you have a sapphire and an emerald and a jade, and you can do a gravity test, meaning you can fill a bowl with water and just warm or cold, it doesn't really matter, and you gently put one of the sapphires or one of the gemstones in, and it sinks to the bottom depending on how fast it sinks to the bottom. This could determine, but then again, it's just a test. I've seen people do these tests before, but it's not very conclusive. So personally, I don't really know the gist behind this test, and I don't really care for it, but some people might actually find that useful. And finally, the general one that jewelers do anyways is the microscopic test, putting it under a microscope to see the gem's inclusions. And if it is very consistent, then it might be synthetic, treated, or just artificial. Whereas some of these other gemstones develop, as I've said, develop their own unique patterns in the natural earth. So to do this test though, if you have access to one of those specialized jewelry microscopes and you know how to use it, by all means go for that. But otherwise, if none of these other tests work, or if you just want quick and fast results, I would recommend taking it to a certified gemologist or taking it to a very reputable jeweler in your area. So that being said, that's going to conclude the video. So if you have any natural gemstones, congratulations, I'm happy for you, and all that other fun stuff. So yeah, that's gonna end the video here. So I will see you guys in the next video.